Let me fucking start over
Sorry.
since you wanted to make this dirty, you sinner. Hey, what's up?
Hello.
Welcome to Left Unread.
Yes, my name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're just two white boys seeking the creation of a working man's republic.
I was hoping you were going to call us two white boys.
Of course.
This episode, we have read Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice by Rudolf Rocker.
Yeah, Rudolf Rocker. He was born in 1873 in Germany. Unfortunately, he was orphaned at a young age. He apprenticed as a bookbinder and took on socialist and anarchist views from giants of anarchist thought like Bakunin. Rocker traveled through Europe, being exiled from one country or another, all while advocating strongly for a libertarian socialist philosophy, finally fleeing to the U.S. in 1933. There, he continued his work and advocacy until his death in 1953.
Nice. Written during the Spanish Civil War as agitprop expounding on the tenets of anarchism for the consciousness raising of the masses, 1937's Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice stands as one of the most popular and most oft-recommended works by one of libertarian anarchism's most beloved writers. Part survey of anarchist praxis, part history of international workers' movements, Anarcho-Syndicalism details from Rocker's point of view the hows and whys of syndicalism's superiority as theory over other popular revolutionary movements of his time. Apparently written due to the provocation of fellow anarchist Emma Goldman, Rocker's Anarcho-Syndicalism remains a foundational text for libertarian anarchists worldwide.
Yeah, she begged him like a couple of times to write this book, which I thought was really interesting. So it goes without saying that a lot of this book really revolves around the events that were happening in Spain. I mean, I watched a little bit of a documentary about the Spanish Civil War just to kind of get some extra context. I mean, I know a little bit already.
Yeah.
But his other writing actually was translated to Spanish, and it was actually pretty popularly released in Spain, especially in Barcelona. You know, where the Barcelona, where the CNT-FAI was quite prominent. You know, and that's where the whole shebang happened, the whole shindig. Yeah.
Yeah, it is really interesting reading this book after the fact, you know, and even reading the afterword.
Yeah.
There's a dejection to his voice that's like, what he hoped to come to pass did not come to pass, and that is quite clear. But there is an optimism in the way that he writes about the Spanish Civil War in the work. Yes.
I'm sure we will have some feelings about the outcomes of mid-century anarchism.
Hey, let's cut that off at the pass. You made a promise.
I did. You're right. You're right. This is going to be a 100% anarchism positive episode. We're not reading these books to shit on anarchists. At least I'm not.
No, I'm definitely not. We are very open to meaningful anarchist theory, and so we're reading more stuff to try to find it.
Yeah, if I can sniff my own farts for a second, you know, we're maintaining a dialectical relationship with anarchists, you know. There needs to be a push and a pull between what we currently believe and the anarchist ideal. In my mind, I think. That's why I'm holding such an open space for anarchism here.
Yes, very open, approach this in good faith, and I think got some good stuff out of it that is very meaningful, whether you call yourself an anarchist or not, to your theory and praxis.
Yeah, rock and roll. How do you want to tackle this thing?
The tenets of anarchist praxis that he presents, I think, are interesting and open us up to what is the first point of conversation that I have, which is like, okay, so he's talking about anarchist praxis like direct action and sabotage, boycott, and then strikes, specifically the general strike. I have a lot to say about the general strike, and I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there.
Yeah.
I also don't necessarily want to go through and be like, Rocker says of the boycott. You know what I mean? Like,
that might be the easiest place to start, is just with like what the actual principles of anarcho-syndicalism are, at least what might contrast it from, say, the party.
I like that.
I think that that's a solid place, because it spins out a lot of different things. You know, like when he says that there's no central decree, or he's espousing a more federal system. Like, those are things that I think we can jump off from.
Yeah. I mean, he literally opens the book with a definition of anarchism.
Yeah.
And then goes on a little bit further to develop that into what are the distinctions of anarcho-syndicalism.
Yeah, I was thinking more so when he was talking in like chapter 5, and he's talking about...
I'm in chapter 3 where I'm starting to see the distinction of syndicalism.
Well, where I'm looking at is in the objectives of anarcho-syndicalism. Just to kind of jump into it broadly here, I mean, he's talking about the active organization of what a syndicate looks like. A trade union organization should be of the character as to afford workers the possibility of achieving the utmost in their struggle against the employers, and at the same time provide them with a basis from which they will be able, in a revolutionary situation, to proceed with the reshaping of economic and social life. That's the goal of the trade union. That's the basis of the syndicate here. And then he says, the workers in each locality join the unions of their respective trades, and these are subject to the veto of no central, but enjoy the entire right of self-determination. The trade unions of a city or rural district combine in a so-called labor cartel. The labor cartels constitute the centers for local propaganda and education. They weld the workers together as a class and prevent the rise of any narrow-minded factional spirit. They organize for solidaristic cooperation. And then to put it into a more grand structure, he says that all of these labor cartels are grouped into the National Federation of Labor Cartels.
Yes, the National Federation of Labor Cartels.
The National Federation of Labor Cartels, which I am 100% positively thinking about right now as my mutual free association.
No,
I'm speaking in earnest, Aaron. This is a free association, a mutual and free association of collaborative and solidaristic organizations. That's what it is.
Let me throw out a quote.
Go ahead, because I just read a whole page.
Yeah, this is going to be a long one, but this is what, full transparency, I came into this book with, in my mind, syndicalism meets trade unionism. It's effectively the definition that I've been working with for the last number of years.
Yeah.
And so when I'm reading this, that's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm getting as a definition of syndicalism according to Rocker. For the AK Press edition, this is on page 56. The term workers' syndicate meant in France at first merely a trade union organization of producers for the immediate betterment of their economic and social status. But the rise of revolutionary syndicalism gave this original meaning a much wider and deeper import. Just as the party is, so to speak, the unified organization for definite political effort within the modern constitutional state and seeks to maintain the bourgeois order in one form or another, so according to the syndicalist view, the trade union, the syndicate, is the unified organization of labor and has for its purpose the defense of the interests of the producers within existing society and the preparing for and the practical carrying out of the reconstruction of social life after the pattern of socialism. And so he says it has a double purpose. It's a fighting organization and an intellectual training of the worker.
Yeah.
It has to do both of those two things because it has to move beyond the economic or social status and into the political realm, where I think one of the rebuttals that is maybe related to what you brought up in the last episode when I was so caught up on trade unionism is that the limits of an economic organization that's always working for reform as opposed to something that has a political consciousness of its own. And so he's arguing here that syndicalism is working to remedy that specific rebuttal, that it is trade unionism turned into a political organization.
Yeah, which I think is so interesting, too, because when he's critiquing Marx and he's talking about the First International, a lot of the times he's talking about Marx as being a purely economic thinker and then shifting that focus of the International into a political struggle, and so it's interesting to think that starting from an economic base in the sense of a trade union and focusing on one side on the defense of those gains, on the
I mean, it is a mischaracterization of Marx to characterize Marx as a purely economic thinker.
Yeah, I absolutely agree there. I think that that's a fault of something that Rocker says here. But I think that it's interesting because he's saying that the economic base of the trade union is before socialism. It predates socialism, right? He says that the labor movement comes from the day-to-day conditions, the day-to-day struggle for bread. And so to think of the labor movement as starting from something that is economic and then shifting into a syndicated body that has a political action to it, something that can actually have political change, something that can create revolutionary change, that I think is interesting. There's so many ways where I think that what Rocker is characterizing is a shared goal. And I think that that's a positive thing.
I agree with that.
Yes.
I agree with that it is a shared goal.
Yes. And also, just to put it out there now, when he's talking about education, he's not talking about propaganda. I mean, he's talking about literally creating the conditions for the classes to upend the current configuration of our class society. He's talking about creating the intrinsic connection in the worker's mind between their liberation and the change of our economic situation. It's not just like propaganda as a political party would do. That's what he says. And so I think that that's important too, because when we're talking about education, and I think I had this feeling a lot when I was reading it, especially when he talks about the purpose of the union, the purpose of the syndicate. The purpose of that organization, right, is to gradually bring about, like I'm looking at in the forerunners of syndicalism, He says that they believe that the Workers' International was destined gradually to gather all effective workers into its ranks and at the proper time to overthrow the economic despotism of possessing classes, and along with this, all the political coercive institutions of the capitalist state. I think that education aspect a lot of times is kind of understated. It's underrepresented because people think of it as just like this gradual change, like we're just building class consciousness and that idea. But it's more than that in this sense, and I think that what Rocker is advocating for is like that same kind of connection that we've been talking about in so many episodes, where the workers are engaging in this day-to-day struggle and actually creating those connections in their mind and building the skills to actually, administer these organizations at the end of the day. Yeah,
it goes beyond purely consciousness raising, and in fact, raising consciousness through action that then allows for the perpetuation of a revolutionary movement after the fact.
Yeah.
Or not even a revolutionary movement, allows for the perpetuation of a people's mutually organized...
That free organization that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I do want to talk about that for a second, because on the same page, he quotes Bakunin, and he asks a really interesting question. Bakunin does. What is the natural organization of these masses? If we're talking about organizing the people into something that is not only representative of their beliefs, but also has the organizational power to create change, then it's an interesting question. What is actually the natural form of this organization? In the Leninist structure, right, we think of the party as something being natural because we construct it, We are basing it off of the people, and there is a democratically central idea to that. And so in that way, it's representative. And what Bakunin is saying is that we already make these organizations in the day-to-day, right? We already make these solidaristic and cooperative organizations. That's the basis of our entire society. We don't need to create a separate structure for that. These organizations are already here. We simply need to bring them together. Where a disagreement may come in is just at what level of coordination. Because I think that what you'll find throughout this book is an advocacy for federalism, an advocacy for a connection, a network of interconnected organizations.
Yeah, federation.
Yeah, and I think that in the same sense that at the end of the day, if we're talking about in a perfect world, the state's withered away, what's left over? We're talking about a group of interconnected administrative organizations. Mm-hmm. And so it's that same alignment that I keep seeing. It's just a question of what it takes to get there, what it actually is going to be until that point. And I think that there's just something really interesting that Bakunin is saying about we actually do already have mutual organizations that can be brought together. We don't necessarily need to create another one.
I would agree. And I think I also came away from this reading feeling much more positive about what MLs and anarchists have in common. The only real sticking point in the distinction that I got from this is actually from this page, where Rocker says that in a council system under anarchism, the liquidation of all institutions of political power must be the first task of the social revolution. That's like the only sticking point between the distinction between what an ML wants to see and what an anarchist wants to see.
Yeah.
Is that an anarchist says this happens immediately and we continue on through that mutual cooperation that has already been kind of naturally imposed through the way that we run our lives through syndicates. An ML would say the party is organizing all of that centrally to the point that it becomes something that we are naturally expected to do, to contribute to, and benefit from, to the point that it is no longer necessary to be necessitated from above.
Yeah.
So the distinction is however much time that takes. You can argue about the efficacy of that one particular point.
Sure.
Which certainly MLs will do.
And Rocker does too. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of despotism from above versus authority from below. I mean, especially in his critique of the Soviet Union, which I have some feelings about, obviously. But, it's not without a kernel of truth, at least. Like when he says there are no Soviets remaining in the Soviet Union, he's not lying. I mean, he's saying that because largely a lot of the power of the Soviets as they were in the beginning were curtailed and sidelined, especially just to get this out of the way. I was really, really chuckling when he is making all these parallels between Soviet states and fascist states. Mm-hmm. And obviously I have some strong feelings about that. There's at one point where he says, like, the tyranny of the socialist state lags behind the fascist one in nothing, in no regard. And I was like, this was in 1938, man. Yeah. We're talking about Hitler and Mussolini. So I had that feeling in the beginning, and then there's a bit of refinement here because 1938 was actually the height of the terror, quote unquote, under Stalin. And so I can see why he would have said that, even if I currently disagree. I mean, I am literally currently reading a book about Stalinist terror, so terror in heavy air quotes, I have strong feelings about regardless, but he makes some really interesting parallels there.
Yeah, I don't think we should make too much time of his analysis of the USSR, because obviously we have very strong feelings that are counter to his analysis.
Right. Again, in 1938, what he was from the outside looking in, seeing is, all the terror of Stalin.
Yeah.
Right? All of the purge and all of that. And so to hold it up and say this lags behind nothing and compare it to someone like Hitler, I'm not sure I agree, but, just wanted to say that.
Okay, so that's syndicalism.
Yeah. And I don't know if we need to create a space to talk about Spain in this episode. I think that it's kind of woven throughout simply because it's what Rocker's observing while he's writing this.
Yeah.
And it's such a bright spark, especially at the time. I mean, he talks completely laudatorily about the CNT-FAI. And I think that there is something interesting about that, and it has to do with what we were just talking about. That difference between MLs and anarchists being top-down, bottom-up. Do we prosecute the revolution now, or are there other things that have to be done beforehand? And I think that Spain is a good example of that, because on a past episode I did express that I thought that a part of the anarchist failing in Spain had to do with its lack of organization, so to speak, and I've developed a little bit more of a nuanced view on that at this point, but I think that there is something interesting about the separation between the Popular Front and the anarchist side of things in Spain, right? Because that was the contradiction there, is that the anarchists and the Trotskyists in Spain, they wanted to do the revolution first. And in Barcelona, they largely had. I mean, that's the thing. Rocker talks about it here as the resistance stopping the fascist uprising, stopping the fascist rebellion. And I think that's largely true. And what they found is that they were out in the streets, they had taken up arms, they were fighting against the fascists, and what they found is that the local police were aligned with them, right? So then they were fighting with the fascists. After that, the workers were still armed, and the police were suddenly told, per this workers' movement down, and they said, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Obviously, we just stood shoulder to shoulder with these men fighting fascists. And so revolution happens. Revolution happens. So passive. But I think that that's really a key context. And there was a reorganization of labor and productive forces in Barcelona and Catalonia, those regions, and it was largely under federative anarchist lines. Okay, I will reserve judgment on how stately that might have been. Maybe I have some quotes on a page that we can come back to there. But again, they had already started doing the revolution in that sense. And that is the big contention between the two left sides of the Spanish Civil War is, do we win the war first or do we do the revolution while we're doing the war? I won't say do the revolution first, because you can't just say, oh, well, hey, wait on the war, guys. You know?
We'll just knock out a quick revolution, then get to the war.
And I'm not about to speak with hindsight here and say, obviously they should have won the war first. Obviously they should have done the revolution first, because I don't know. I don't know what that entailed. I do know what actually happened, though, and it's that fascism won. And so I just think that it's just important context for this discussion, because the events in Spain are on record. We can look back and see what actually happened. And Rocker does that in this book, too. I mean, he talks a lot about what happened to the largely popular anarchist movements throughout Europe. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but it seems that crushed by fascism is the number one cause of death.
Yeah, as I was getting to the end of the book, it's like Mussolini defeats the anarchists. Hitler defeats the anarchists. The Nazis defeat the anarchists. It's just kind of one after the other. Yeah. Which is a bummer.
Yeah, and, just to do a little self-crit, I was maybe shitting on Enrico Malatesta in the last Anarchist Primer episode for being quote-unquote complacent during the rise of fascism, but obviously not. Obviously he's there. But Rocker makes note that after the breakdown of the largely left forces in Spain and the what he says, like the bourgeois betrayal, they sought to utilize Mussolini to put down the people and only realized it was too late, after the fact. What do you know?
Yeah.
The remaining anarchist forces rallied around Malatesta, he says. And so just to give the guy some credit, I will say that.
I am legitimately interested to get into Malatesta a little bit. He seems like a pretty interesting dude, to say the least.
I've said it before, man, but I think that Italians are certifiably insane. I think that there's something going on.
I'm not allowed to say that.
When they brought those 6 nations together and reorganized and made one Italy, they did something. They unleashed forces beyond their control.
Okay, so I guess anytime we are asking for recommendations for Anarchist lit to read for the show, a big part of what I'm after is anarchist theory or anarchist praxis.
Yeah.
And what I fuck with in terms of the anarchist praxis that Rocker lays out here, I definitely fuck with boycotts. I definitely fuck with direct action and sabotage. I think those are meaningful, and if organized effectively, if they're organized intentionally, they can be very, very effective tools in revolutionary action, in organization. He also spends quite a lot of time talking about strikes, and specifically the general strike.
Yeah.
And that's been on the top of my mind a lot lately, just largely because in a post-No Kings world, there's a lot of talk about a general strike or whatever. And it's interesting to counterpose effective use of the general strike that Rocker is outlining in countries that had meaningful trade union movements versus our context now, where trade unionism in the United States is effectively gone. It's effectively disappeared. And capitalism has become so imperialized that even if there were still unions in the United States organizing a general strike, so much of the work that creates production is not done by those facilities any longer anyway. I can't see the general strike as a meaningful tactic any longer.
Yeah, and it's something I was just about to say, is that something I had to wrangle with in this book is a question to myself, and it's how much of my animosity towards these kind of tactics come from a sense of helplessness in today's society, you know? Because honestly, when you see a call for a general strike in the U.S., it's as laughable as an Instagram infographic. You know, we don't have an organized structure that could coordinate in any sense a general strike that could be effective for long enough to create real change. I don't see the fucking AFL-CIA doing anything like that. You know, AFS-CME. It's just not going to happen, guys. So I think that there's a distaste that I have for calls for that kind of action simply because it feels so pointless. But it's not that those things are ineffective. It's just that in the U.S. we have a crumbling post-industrial society.
Yeah, it's not as a strategy ineffective, but it's in the United States putting the cart before the horse. Yeah. Big time.
Yeah, you truly have to ask the question, like, what would it take to get to the point where we could call for a general strike? I mean, it would take... I don't know what it would take. That's the thing. Like, there's my question right there. What would it take to rebuild that kind of trade union mindset in the U.S., right? Is it even possible? You know, just as you were saying, we've exported so much of our industry. How do you rebuild that kind of thing? You know, it's not like you just sign the PRO Act into law and then call it a day.
Yeah, it becomes a question of, like, I'm not trying to answer your obviously rhetorical question. Yeah. Because I also have that question. My thoughts about how to respond to it are you need the majority of workers to be meaningfully organized, and a general strike needs to target particular industries specifically because, as made mention already, so much of manufacturing has been shipped overseas that we can no longer shut down production, but what we can do is shut down the import and export of those goods that have been produced elsewhere. And so, like, targeting particular industries around that seems to be the only effective measure. Okay,
this is something in progress, so I can't speak as to its overall efficacy, but, like, I'm thinking about the Global Samud Flotilla went to Gaza, and they were detained, obviously, and with them were Spanish and Italian ships. And the dock workers in Italy said they would make Italy bleed, right, if those people were captured, and they did proceed to strike, you know, and awesome. I mean, really cool.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Really sick shit. That's righteous. And, like, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. You know, core industries saying, we're not fucking doing this anymore. They're coming together and they're going on strike. And the question I have, and this is not a cynical question, but what's the outcome been? You know?
Well, and the other component of that, which maybe gets to your question a little bit, is aside from organizing the unions, aside from organizing the actual general strike itself, you also need infrastructure to support that strike continuing.
I think about it all the time, you know, like, how do you feed these people?
Like right now, we're on the cusp of many, many people losing access to SNAP benefits, as an example. And that's one of the things that their organizations in our area are organizing around, trying to create infrastructure to, like, literally feed people, because we don't know how long that's going to go on.
Indefinitely is the answer.
But, like, that's the sort of infrastructure that has to be organized ahead of time, proactively, before something like a general strike can happen.
Yeah. And to be honest, I just don't know if we have that kind of capacity right now, you know? I just don't have that kind of knowledge.
Yeah. The question then becomes, though, what's the 21st century analog to the general strike? I don't know.
I don't know either. No, I don't know is the thing. You know, I don't know. because the general strike seems final. What's above that? Arming the people? I mean, like literally creating a militarized group and just start handing out rifles or something? I mean, that's the only thing that seems more severe in the steps it's taking, right?
Yeah, the general strike is more of a passive action as opposed to something like arming the people, which,
Sure.
becomes a very active action.
Okay, but hold on, though, because I don't think it is necessarily. And in fact, I think in the way that Rocker is advocating for, it calls for violence, right? It calls for an escalation of general strikes, which will either create the conditions for violence and specifically revolutionary violence, whether that is coming from the government towards the people or it's coming from the people towards the government. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree with that. But like when I say it's a passive action, I mean, this is like what we've talked about when we've talked about revolutionary violence in the past. It's accepting violent action and defending yourself against it is very different than instigating violent action against others. And I think like if we're talking about on a mass scale, people getting behind a particular movement, it's a lot easier to get behind the defense of one's safety than it is to get a mass of people behind the taking of one's safety.
Agree. But what I'm just thinking now is that, like, I don't know if we're ever seeking an active movement in that sense. I feel like I
think we are not.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I think even in, like, armed militant movements like, say, the Black Panthers, they were arming themselves in preparation for a defensive response.
It was the party of community defense.
Yeah. I was looking for the quote where he says that there's a series of increasingly violent general strikes until revolution happens, which I'm sure is whenever he's talking about the general strike. He talks about in Spain how it escalated until it was a social general strike and led to armed resistance. Coal, electric power, raw materials. What would that look like today? I guess the same industries? Because like what even are such our vital industries, or the first thing that popped into my mind was like healthcare, but crippling the healthcare industry wouldn't create a revolutionary situation.
No.
It would just kill us.
Yeah, so that was what I meant with the like capitalism in the United States has been so imperialized. Yeah. Like we're not manufacturing goods by and large on this continent any longer.
Dude.
So so much of what we're doing is service and bureaucratic. Shutting those industries down certainly does like gum up the works, but it's not the same thing as like the coal miners going on strike. You know what I mean? I mean, There are still coal miners, of course. But I
guess, it would probably have to be transport. Something logistical would be the main thing. I mean, I guess that's why like in Italy, the shipyards are the main source of where you see that kind of union struggle happening.
Trucking would be a big one.
Trucking would be a big one. But even then, it's so contractualized, like it's so independent contractorized that it's really tough.
Owner-operator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, God. I mean, Jesus, man. I see people on TikTok all the time showing how they have to, they view all of the loads on the iPad. I follow one guy who just shows, like, the most ridiculous loads. He's like, I'm carrying... Stop.
You're calling them loads.
Hauls, pardon me, Aaron. Get your mind out of the fucking gutter.
This guy's got so many loads in back.
Dude, this guy's got a gross load back there. No, okay, let me fucking start over since you wanted to make this dirty, you sinner. I follow so many truckers that show their hauls. God damn it. Trucking would be a great thing to create a strike condition in.
Yeah. I was also thinking of another vital industry like trash.
Yeah.
That is one that
trash is
shuts
a classic.
Down the city.
Yeah, that's a classic.
And something around food production, but distribution is really the big thing there.
Yeah.
So it comes back to trucking again.
I guess it would be like Kroger Stock Boys or something. You'd have to get trucking.
Stock Boys strike.
Trucking, the Stock Boys strike would be lit, dude.
Yeah.
Just a flash mob where everybody steals everything in a Kroger.
It's not a bad idea.
It's not a great idea.
That's effectively sabotage, though.
Yeah.
That's more sabotage than a strike.
Yeah. Just not to shift us completely off of the topic of a strike, but I really appreciated the way he talked about sabotage in here, because I was obviously thinking about blowing up a pipeline or something like that, hypothetically speaking, in theory.
Not you personally.
Yes. The casualness at which you said that was so great. Yeah, if someone were to blow up a pipeline, that kind of sabotage. But he talks about slowdowns, he talks about sit-ins, he talks about go canny, all of that stuff, which we've seen mentioned before. And I just, every time it pops up, I really appreciate it, because it's that kind of like malicious compliance. Like, sure, we're gonna fucking work, man, but bad wages, bad work. You know, trash in, trash out. That's classic.
Yeah, of course. Likewise, I also, when I'm thinking of sabotage, I'm thinking a lot about the Earth Liberation Front, the Animal Liberation Front, monkey wrenching, raids where they're saving animals and or torching facilities.
Yeah.
I would never do something like that, obviously. But that's what I'm thinking of when I think about sabotage.
Yeah. Personally, I would never get sawdust and put it inside the gas tank of an industrial vehicle that might be utilized for capitalist purposes, but
No.
that form of sabotage is a possibility in the scope of all things sabotaging.
The sabotaging scope, yes.
Yeah, on the sabotage spectrum. You know, that's all we're saying here is there's a spectrum of sabotage.
Yeah.
A spectrum of sabotage.
Sawdust, sugar.
Everything's a little sabotage when you think about it.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Kind of hard to weave it in. There's a lot of good history here. I will say that. I appreciated a lot of the anarchist history.
I would agree. It was interesting to get a new view of history that we already know about, and there were things in here that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, and also somewhat topical. I mean, like he talks about the Chartists and things. Some of the organizations are really truly inspirational. Like when he talks about the Grand National Council of Trade Unions, and he says like, you know, we don't need the House of the Commons. We don't want representation, right? Change the economic situation, and that will solve this representational issue. You know, we don't want this to be signed into law. We don't even need you to make it a law. We can make our own short day. We can make our own 10-hour day just with our own organization. It simply has to be allowed. That's something I really appreciated there. A thought that crossed my mind, though, was in this framework of a trade union, right? Its initial aspect includes an employer. There's a revolution that goes kind of unspoken here, and it's not that. It's not that there isn't a revolution. Like, they're pretty clear about that, but, like, where did the employers go? You know, did they just kill them all? Like, is it just the people's purge instead? I mean, what are we talking about here? I don't know. This is an unformed thought, but I'm just thinking about how the trade union has a framework in mind that involves workers versus employers.
You brought up a question, I feel like it was in the Socialist Reconstruction episode, which was effectively, if there are no employers, why do there need to be trade unions?
Yeah.
If we're all mutually cooperating with one another in our work, what are we unionizing against or for, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's something still there.
How connected can a federation of free, mutually associated organizations be before they stop being separate organizations, I guess is the question. And this is kind of a question that I've had in mind throughout this book, and it's two-parted.
Okay.
In one half, to what extent are anarchists recreating the state? The other half, though, is on the other side, right? In what aspect are Leninists recreating anarchism? And I think that this is one of those things where you can kind of see both sides of that equation, because it's kind of looking at the same thing from two directions, right? In the anarchist sense, we're taking a loose federation of all of these organizations and we're working cooperatively, solidaristically to the point where there might as well not be a separation. You know, there's no exploitation, there's no domination, simply free associative mutual cooperation, right? The kind of safeguarding of life from cradle to grave, as Rocker says, doesn't need to be present because the conflicts of class society have been removed by revolution.
Sure.
Okay. In that sense, though, how long before all of those connected organizations meld into one organization? You know, at that point, are we not talking about something central, right? Something state-like. To back it up with Rocker's own quote, let's go to page 94 and 5 for me, which is in the Objectives of Anarcho-Syndicalism. And he talks about the National Federation of Labor Cartels, a single national federation. He says, it's the task of these alliances to arrange for cooperative action of all local groups, to conduct solidaric strikes where the necessity arises, and to meet all the demands of the day-to-day struggle between capital and labor. We're talking about something that doesn't require a decree, something that's still mutually cooperative. And he even says on the next page, through the agency of National Federation of Labor Cartels, it would be possible to calculate the total requirement of the country and adjust the work of production accordingly. So we're still talking about something planned, something that is administered over one body. And that always raises a question in my mind. How close are we getting to the state here? You know, and it even comes to me in questions about things like borders. You know what I mean? Like, just in a thought experiment, you create your beautiful mutual free association. your collective, and, your vanguard, so to speak, raises the consciousness enough to create revolutionary conditions, the people rise up and you have a revolution, okay? While your organization and its reach may not recognize borders, all the countries around you probably still do. At best, they'll accept the borders that were already there. So now you have your lovely mutual red zone. It's just boarded off by 4 other borders, not your own borders, right? I don't mean to be too cynical here, so let's move away from the border part, right? You have a bunch of mutual organizations all working together. You're working together to plan the output and distribution of all the products of that organization. You have a way for people to find these decentralized organizations in these different sections. How far along can you get before you start losing coalition members because you are creating a state? You know what I mean? That's really the question I have. Say that we were to go into that, how far along would it be before it starts violating the ideal? Would it ever violate the ideal if we were to just do it in that sense?
Yeah, this is related to a question that I have purely in good faith that I expressed in the Anarchist Primer episode more cynically. I will acknowledge. Because at that point, when we were reading Bookchin, and I asked, what is his fucking love affair with the individual? And I thought a lot of what he had to say about individualism was like very kind of flowery and idealistic and utopian, and like he was honoring the creative liberty of the individual so much so that it felt kind of grossly laudatory to me. And I said something, kind of shitty about it. While I was reading this, I wasn't getting the same vibe, but I had the same kind of question about the tension between mutualism and individualism. And what you were just saying there brought my mind to something that Rocker said in the Objectives of Anarcho-Syndicalism chapter. He says, putting the right of self-determination of every member above everything else and recognizing only the organic agreement of all on the basis of like interests and common convictions is his goal. But I still see those two things as often at odds. Mm-hmm. Self-determination of the individual and the interests and convictions of the common people. And that was one of the topics that I had written for us to discuss here, because there are a couple other quotes that brought it to mind. But it's like, where is that line, right? Like you're saying, kind of where is the line where you start to lose anarchists for your organization becoming too much of a state, versus where is the point where you lose MLs because you're so focused on the individual that you're negating all of the practicality of centralizing an organization.
Right.
And it's like, I firmly believe that there, like you said at the start of the show, there's a dialectical relationship here where, and I said something like this on a previous episode, I actually think it's good to have anarchists pushing back on MLs and MLs to be pushing back on anarchists, because I think we find something mutually beneficial in the middle.
Yeah.
Or somewhere in between, I'll say. Maybe it's not the middle. But that's just still one of the questions that I had, because it also, to me, relates to these points that Rocker was saying about class solidarity, where I see that as a disruption. The idea that we are so focused on an individual's ability to self-determine their life that can be very disruptive to an idea of class solidarity, which is necessary to see this organization, whether it be a federation or a Soviet or an organized, the state, capital T. There's always going to be a tension there that I don't know how to overcome. I don't know that Rocker addresses how it's overcome, other than somehow allowing, in his mind, room for the individual to self-determine while also allowing for these organizations to naturally flow without any kind of difficulty.
Well, I think that the answer is a collective one, and that's the thing. And that the reason that we're not necessarily willing to even hear that answer as being apparent is the fact that we have repression in mind. We have the consequences of revolution in mind. And it's not that anarchists don't, it's just that a collective solution is present always. Say you have a collection of organizations and you need to come to a decision. Can you come to a consensus? Sure.
You can come to a plurality.
Yeah. Can you come to a decision? Can you come to an agreement? I'm sure you can.
Yeah, that it requires reasonableness on the part of every individual to come in and say, like, I recognize that my right to self-determination is not more important than everyone's right to self-determination, and so we have to do it for the greater good or the collective good.
Yeah, and I think that, if we're talking about a society that's constructed on that basis, then totally. Right. And the thing is that we're still just thinking of the in-betweens. We're thinking about, we are trying to make revolution happen. We're aiming for the success of revolution. And I don't just mean that as like, we win the war, we get power, we do whatever. But we're literally talking about the upending of class society. Right. We're talking about the acceptance of people of the ideal of a classless society. And what that entails is counter-revolution as well. And I'm not saying that there isn't an anarchist response to counter-revolution. It's just that I think that that's just where a lot of the disagreement comes in, because when you start talking about expediency or, necessity for immediate defense or whatever, it's where you start to get into the authoritarian discussion. And I don't know if that's something we want to talk about here but I mean, Rocker has a particular view about the balance of power, so to speak, between a top-down dictatorship and a bottom-up democracy. He says very clearly that a top-down dictatorship will always stamp out the other because it
creates a new privileged class.
Yeah, it's the creation of that class requires its maintenance. And the thing is, but the thing is this, the two parts of that question, right? In what ways do anarchists recreate the state? In what ways do MLs recreate anarchism? Is that I think the MLs recreate anarchism in a bunch of ways, and I think they're accepting of it. Is the ultimate goal a loose association of administrative organizations? Yes. Is the ultimate goal an abolition of all class and hierarchy? Yes. They are willing to acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. There's no, we rally against this idea because it's anarchistic or anything. And I don't think that anarchists do the same. I don't think that they're willing to acknowledge that there is more statehood in their organization than they think. And I think that kind of problem is popping up here again because we're talking about what is required for the actual defense of a revolution. It requires some things.
Yeah, I mean, maybe anarchists will come at me for this being an unfair characterization, but I think the distinction there is that MLs, communists, are looking at the material need and responding in kind. Anarchists have a philosophical problem with the state. And so, MLs are more willing to make concessions or acknowledge the material conditions that will come in the future, where anarchists are so wedded to that idea of the future and concerned that ML's path will not get us there that they reject it outright.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about that same question that Rocker is posing.
I got a quote I got to throw in here if this is where we're going.
I think it might be.
Well, because there's one point. From the objectives of anarcho-syndicalism, he's talking about the CNT-FAI. And he says, talking about them trying to stand against fascism, he says, under these circumstances, it is perhaps understandable that the syndicates have not thus far been able to bring to completion their great task of social reconstruction, and for the time being were unable to give their full attention to the organization of consumption. The war, the possession by the fascist armies of important sources of raw materials, the German and Italian invasion, the hostile attitude of foreign capital, the onslaughts of the counter-revolution in the country itself, which significantly was befriended this time by Russia and the Communist Party of Spain, all this and many other things have compelled the syndicates to postpone many great and important tasks until the war is brought to a victorious conclusion. I understand and agree with that analysis, that the literal conditions in a moment force you to make non-ideal concessions and decisions sometimes. I don't understand why he's so willing to give that the benefit of the doubt to the anarchists in Spain and not give that same allowance to the USSR, for example.
Just to follow that up, back on 92 and 93, 94, 95, those are my favorite fucking pages, apparently. But he's talking about the literal organization of the CNT-FAI, and he says, in the larger alliances were naturally established, official representatives were necessary. These were elected for 1 year only and received the same pay grade as the workers in their trade. Even the general secretary of the CNT was no exception to this rule. Mm-hmm. So it's... and I don't mean to just be like, look, guys, they've got a fucking general secretary, too. Clearly, there's hierarchy here.
Yeah.
But it's the same kind of organization that we're talking about. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's some positive association to be had there because we are talking about the same thing, guys, aren't we? Wait, hold on. I need to finish my thought from earlier.
Yes,
okay?
Please do.
What I'm saying is that Leninists are willing to accept that. They are willing to make that concession, and I think anarchists are not. Because I think that a Leninist would agree with exactly what Rocker's saying, right? The use of the state is to create a privileged class. And that privileged class requires maintenance. The privileged class in the Leninist argument is the proletariat, right? And he's also arguing that being the majority class changes things. It literally changes the structure of this relationship because the majority is making the decision. I mean, that's the argument ever since episode 2 and 3 when we read State and Revolution.
Yeah.
That's never changed. Now, I know that Rocker has some difficulties with the dictatorship of the proletariat.
He says it's a sophisticated trick to fool a simpleton. Come on.
Just a great... I also love, he does a little barb where he talks about German economic metaphysicalness, and that just really cracked me up because, unfortunately... I've been thinking about Hegel not to unfortunately, because I've been like, man, I really do not want to read Hegel. We are not going to read Hegel.
Fuck that.
I know better than that.
Yeah.
But I kind of might need to read Hegel.
Have fun.
I need to put it into day-to-day practice, so it is like cocaine. Just an interesting point. This is a weird aside, but so interesting to me that so many MLs are willing to be supportive of the Popular Front in the lens of Stalin, but in every other collaboration with liberal, every other seemingly liberal coalition ends in betrayal and disaster. Interesting how they keep making that point again and again, but when Stalin does it in the Popular Front, we're like, oh, maybe this time works. We just got done reading Connolly, where again and again and again the Irish workers are betrayed by the people, and here we are saying maybe the Spanish workers should have collaborated with the liberals a little better, and then they could have won the war. I don't know if that's a fair parallel. If you have strong feelings about that, you can let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Please do.
Anyway, what else are you feeling here?
Well, I mean, you brought up the dictatorship of the proletariat, and there are a couple of quotes that stood out to me that are going to come off a little negative, but like in a good faith way, I have questions.
Hey, I'm the only one that promised positivity here.
That is true. I did actually, while I was reading this and editing last episode, I was like, I never said I wasn't going to be negative.
Right.
But nonetheless, to honor what you're bringing to this episode, I'm trying not to be a negative Nancy.
This is going to be such a funny episode. I can already feel it.
Rocker, very early on, this is in the first chapter, Anarchism, Its Aims and Purposes, is kind of outlining why he sees the dictatorship of the proletariat as farcical, as like not something that will ever come to pass. And he's effectively making the means don't match the ends argument that you hear anarchists give a lot.
Right.
And he starts with what I think is a bad analogy, talking about organs of the human body as similar to organs of the social body. Changed conditions of life produce changed organs, but an organ always performs the function it was evolved to perform or a related one, and it gradually disappears or becomes rudimentary as soon as its function is no longer necessary to the organism. And I just think that that's a bad analogy. The question is, okay, so if you're using that as an analogy to raise the question of how long is it going to take for the state to wither away, and his answer is it won't, because an organ that is created to serve a purpose, and if that purpose still exists, the organ must also exist. And he's using the human body as an example of that. I submit to you the vestigial tail. I submit to you the appendix. Like, these things take time. The whole point is that it was once necessary and over time gradually becomes less and less necessary to the point that it eventually withers away.
Yes. To extend this, the quote I thought you were going to read on the very next page.
Yeah.
He says, one cannot at will hear with his eyes and see with his ears. Also, one cannot at pleasure transform an organ of social oppression into an instrument for the liberation of the oppressed. And all I got to say there is, who said anything about pleasure? I don't think anyone's talking about pleasure here. Okay? That's all I got to say about that.
Next to that quote, I wrote that I fundamentally disagree with that as a characterization. I mean, I've already said before that I see the state as a tool, much like a rifle, and its use is dependent upon the bearer of that weapon. It can be a weapon of oppression, a tool of oppression, or it can be a tool of liberation. It depends on the bearer. And so I just fundamentally disagree with that characterization.
Maybe I've said this before, but, and I think this has to do with what you said earlier about anarchists holding the state as a philosophical idea. What is an anarchist definition of the state? Is it just like a government? The body of people? Like, that's what I feel that I'm missing when I am working through all of these arguments, is that I don't have a firm definition for what anarchists believe the state is. But the thing is that, like, even in this essay, when he says that they recognize that the modern state is just the consequence of capitalist economic monopoly, it's like, so do we, man.
Yeah.
So what about if it's a proletarian economic monopoly? Are we talking about something different there? Are we talking about the same thing? Like, if it's a consequence of a different thing, if it's a consequence of a different situation, why wouldn't a different organ grow? Yeah. And, still in a positive note, we are not talking about using the same organ anyway. What will replace the smashed state apparatus? The apparatus has been smashed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a state in its name. only, I guess, in the sense that it's fundamentally transformed once it is taken over by the people. Once it becomes a dictatorship of the proletariat, it is fundamentally, categorically different than it was previously.
The conditions that have led to its creation are different conditions, just as Rocker is saying.
Yeah.
Another agreement I have with Rocker.
This is we're circling around what is the underlying my discomfort with anarchist theory in general, and what I'm reading all of this stuff looking for answers for is that a lot of the foundations of the attitude of an anarchist are centered around words that I think are too ambiguously defined. Rocker uses words like freedom and justice. He says social justice quite often in a way that I don't feel like he ever presents a meaningful definition of what those terms are, and so I can't get behind his characterization of them.
I love that because he talks about rights. What really makes a right? Just to have a right on paper doesn't matter. He says this: political rights do not exist because they have been legally set down on a piece of paper, but only when they have become the ingrown habit of a people, and when any attempt to impair them will meet with the violent resistance of the populace.
Yep.
I think that that's a great definition about the kind of ultimate rights that we're seeking here. And maybe I shouldn't use the word ultimate there. Anyway. But the thing is that, like, apply that definition to today. We are seeing our freedoms trampled upon daily. Are any of these attempts being met with the violent resistance of the populace? I would argue no. So do we really retain these freedoms under the same definition? No. Mm-hmm. Right? Again, we're talking about the idea of these freedoms and rights being changed when they're acquired. We're talking about them being shifted as we fight for them. Creating the mentality in people that they need to defend these rights is also a goal of us.
Yeah, I just wrote okay next to that quote because I agree that you are not afforded a freedom because it's been written on some piece of paper, however important we decide that piece of paper is. You are afforded a freedom because you and others are willing to fight for it.
You have privileges that require maintenance. I agree.
Yes.
Rudolf Rocker, I agree.
He's just very unfair to the Bolsheviks in this case.
I don't care to hear any of his criticisms of the Soviet Union. I just really don't.
Yes, he lost me with his criticism of the Soviet Union with one line. It doesn't make any difference. It's not the most important part of the work. I'm willing to look past his unfair characterization of the Soviet Union and his odd choice to focus on socialism in Germany to criticize it rather than to criticize socialism in the USSR. I'm willing to look past that to see the theory beyond it.
Likewise.
Anyway, those ideas like social justice or freedom, they're just too abstract. They're too ambiguous. What I appreciate about that is it allows room for a philosophical conversation. I've talked before about what I see as a need for moralism in Marxism.
Yeah.
Because Marxists are so focused on material reality that abstract notions of things like morality are inconsequential to them. I think that's harmful to the movement. I don't disagree that it's not a scientific conversation to talk about morality. It is inherently relative. But I think there's room for it in a movement to bring people in and to have meaningful debate around material conditions that are centered on the way it is impacting people, which comes around, involves a conversation around morality. I appreciate that anarchism is so open to ideas like that and to center so much of their praxis on things like freedom, self-determination, things that are inherently ambiguous, even if I think that that's problematic down the line. I appreciate that they make room for that.
Yeah.
We make room for that.
There's something that's interesting about... I'll give Rocker some credit because I think... I'm looking at page 113, so I guess it's literally the next page over from where we just were.
Okay.
He says... Of course, if one accepts Lenin's cynical phrase and thinks of freedom as merely a bourgeois prejudice, then to be sure, political rights and liberties have no value at all for workers. But then all the countless struggles of the past, all the revolts and revolutions to which we owe those rights are also without value. To proclaim this bit of wisdom, it would hardly have been necessary to overthrow Tsarism, for even the censorship of Nicholas II would certainly have had no objection to the designation of freedom as bourgeois prejudice. Great zinger. Credit to Rocker for that.
Yeah.
But that first part of that, I don't know, there's something there. I'm having complex feelings. I think that we need to read more Marx. I'm sorry to say that that's my reaction to this, but one, I think we should read the German ideology, even if it's not a real piece. I don't care about that. But we should also read the 18th Brumaire.
That's next on my list, for sure.
Yeah, when he was talking about the French trade union movement, and then guess what happens? Louis Bonaparte. And so it's like, we happen to know a very socialist writer who has written extensively about that. Maybe we should check that out.
Yeah, this will lay bare my ignorance about the First International, but his characterization and his critique of Marx, Rocker's characterization of Marx as like somehow strong-arming the First International and kicking the anarchists out, seems to me a very fundamentally anti-anarchist attitude to take. Let me just call up some of the quotes here, because
I will say that there is some truth that rings about Marx's distasteful interactions with some of his opposing members of, the First International.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that he loved calling Bakunin a pedophile, so it's like, what can I, how do you agree with that? How do you find consensus with that guy?
Yeah, well...
pedophile!
I mean, is he back there shouting it while Bakunin's trying to talk?
I mean, essentially.
But wouldn't you?
You just publish it in the letters. I don't actually know. Was he a pedophile? See,
I don't know the answer to that.
It begs the question, Aaron. No, it doesn't.
So this characterization of Marx in the First International. This is at the end of the Forerunners of Syndicalism chapter. He's talking about Marx, and he says that his behavior was in sharp violation not only of the spirit, but also the statutes of the International. Because he says that Marx and his followers directly provoked the open split in the International with all its disastrous consequences for the development of the labor movement, and that it led to that intellectual stagnation and moral degeneration in the socialist movement which we can observe today in most countries. Continuing on, Marx and Bakunin were merely the most prominent representatives of the opposed factions in this struggle between two different conceptions of the fundamental principles of socialism. But the effort to make all schools of thought subservient to one particular school, one which moreover represented only a small minority in the International, could but lead to a cleavage and to the decline of the great alliance of workers, could but destroy those promising germs which were of such great importance to the labor movement in every land. Lastly, the defeat of the Paris Commune and the incipient reaction in France, which in a few years spread over Spain and Italy as well, pushed the fruitful idea of a council system for labor far into the background. What he's describing is a very democratic procedure. Someone shows up, lays out their attitude and ideas about the way that they should organize. They start in the minority, but end up leaving this situation with a majority support, and then they continue on. He's suggesting that this is somehow bad, that Marx showing up and cleaving, it's like it just stinks of the left unity rhetoric that you hear all of the time. Where
like it should have just worked together.
Yeah. Where is the problem here? Like, if the council didn't hold him to account for this, then what was the problem?
It also maybe this is also showing my ignorance of Marx himself, what Marx was actually advocating in the First International. But I found his characterization of Marx's and Engels' position as the side of parliamentary politics to be kind of odd. I mean, at least in our readings of Marx and Engels so far, I haven't gotten any parliamentary vibes.
Yeah,
certainly not. So it's funny because when I read that, advocates of direct revolutionary action, I was like, oh, obviously Marx, but he's referring to Bakunin there. So I don't know. Maybe, that's where I'm like, do I really need to read, like, shout outs to that listener who recommended the Foundations of the Split in the First International to us. I ain't reading a 700-page tome of fucking, so give me the Spark Notes.
I mean, this is 150 years later.
I was about to say.
Why would we?
Yeah.
It just feels weird to come at Marx in that way.
Yeah.
In this case.
No, I think I agree with you about, that kind of, it's like holding space for the individual in what should be a collective group. Although I will say that he does characterize the International as not being a body for any particular idea, but like literally a fucking book club, no, a discussion group. I mean, like a place to bounce those ideas off of each other. So I guess if you're holding it in that framework, then to think of one coming in and then trying to subsume everybody, but
with their ideas, it's not like it was an armed takeover
it was
or something.
Spiteful and personal. Okay,
maybe toward Bakunin, I guess,
and LaSalle.
I don't know. Again, I'm ignorant of the history of the First International, so what do I know? But
I don't know either.
Even Rocker's characterization of it here, which is intended to be negative toward Marx, I think, sounds like Marx came in, wowed everybody with his great fucking ideas.
Okay, now who sounds biased, man?
Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds like a very democratic thing that for some reason Rocker is opposed to, and I don't understand.
Pedophile, pedophile, pedophile.
But like, whose side are you on when fucking protesters are disrupting Kamala Harris's book tour? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm yeah.
I can't say that it's true that Bakunin is a pedophile or anything like that. But I mean, if he was,
I'd want somebody to be taking him out of power. No, I don't know, man. Let's get out of the First International. Yeah.
The only other thing I have here is about the kind of double edge of combating revisionism. I think Rocker says something kind of interesting about it, and it's especially in the context of our conversation last time around the national question.
Yeah.
It really stood out to me. So I'd like to jump into that if we can.
Yeah.
This is in the first chapter, near the end, Anarchism, Its Aims and Purposes. This is like 3 pages before the chapter is done. The so-called totalitarian state, which now rests like a mountain weight upon whole peoples and tries to mold every expression of their intellectual and social life to the lifeless pattern set by a political providence, suppresses with ruthless and brutal force every effort at altercation of the existing conditions. And the question that I have here is really very similar to a question I've had in the past, but where is the line with this and how does it get defined? Because there is a point, not to quote Stalin while we're talking about Rocker, but like where you're between two fires, right? You know that you're going to be dealing with attempts at suppression from without, but also there are always going to be certain amounts of attempts at repression and suppression from within. And Rocker is calling this any attempt to answer those inner suppressions as ruthless and brutal force. And there obviously has to be room for questioning and presenting alternatives to, like, the party line, so to speak, or whatever the anarchist version of that is, you know, like the decisions of the collective. There has to be room for dissent, but like, where is the line with defining that dissent between acceptable and unacceptable? You know, where is the point where it is productive versus counter-revolutionary, you know, something like that. And I don't know how to articulate how this wraps up with the national question, but you made mention in the last episode, like, it puts you to the right of most communists because most communists are going to say the answer they seek is the dissolution of the American state. And I agree with that. Theoretically, I seek the dissolution of the American state.
Knock, knock, knock.
Yeah. I would agree with that, but I also see the value in, say, like Connolly's History of Ireland as like having a national identity that helps you organize, but then that opens doors to like more division from within. If you have, say, a smaller ethnic group within an organization that maybe has their own ideas about the ways things should happen, that really muddies the waters with how you're responding to that sort of dissent. You know, it becomes very quickly a question of like of racism or racist suppression or something like that. You know, I don't know.
I think that there is some particularity in the American ideal because it's one that's constructed of many people. Like, it's constructed of a diverse nation, a melting pot, whatever
theoretically
you want to say.
It's supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly. I don't necessarily think that putting forth this blanket Americanism will come with it messages of equality or anything like that. That's not what I'm advocating for. But I think that there's something to be said about the construction of an ideal. I don't know. In relation to the national question, I think what Rocker is trying to do here is to say that, like, this isn't anarchism in one country. It's to set forth an idea, like an idea. He says it here. Anarchism recognizes only the relative significance of ideas, institutions, and social forms. It is therefore not a fixed, self-enclosed social system, but rather a definite trend in the historical development of mankind, which, in contrast with the intellectual guardianship of all clerical and government institutions, strives for the free, unhindered unfolding of all individual and social forces in life. And it's that trend that I think he's really harping on there. And it's that same kind of issue we were talking about earlier, like what's coming from within versus what's coming from without. Because while your Vanguard institution might say, collectively, we all believe in this associative, cooperative, solidaristic organization, unless every single person on the planet thinks the same way, you will at some point be corralled.
Yeah.
He says on way later, It's actually right at the start of chapter 4, Objectives of Anarcho-Syndicalism, where he says, socialism steadily lost its character of a cultural idea, which was to prepare the peoples for the dissolution of capitalist society, and therefore could not let itself be halted by the artificial frontiers of national states. It's that same thing I was talking about earlier. Even though you may not accept those artificial frontiers, somebody else still imposes them, And so what your reaction is to that imposition is pretty meaningful. I don't necessarily think that Rocker has something in plan for that thing. He's just saying, like, we don't want to respect these ideas. This isn't what we want to be defined by, but they're not the ones setting those boundaries. That's kind of my issue here.
I get what you're saying. I'm wrestling with, I guess I'm just reiterating the same question about self-determination. Because back to the same page where I got that last quote, right after what you had read, where it strives for the free, unhindered unfolding of all the individual and social forces in life.
Yeah.
Even freedom is only a relative, not an absolute concept, since it tends constantly to become broader and to affect wider circles in more manifold ways. And the vital, concrete possibility for every human being to bring to full development all the powers, capacities, and talents with which nature has endowed him and turn them into social account. The full development of the powers, capacities, and talents of every individual is not always going to work toward the mutual benefit of all people, of all individuals, right? And so, like, there's always going to be some line where, like you said, it only goes as far as everyone else accepts it, like in your border analogy. What is the anarchist response to that? What is an appropriate response to that, given that an individual, or let's even say a group of individuals, like, there are enough of them that it becomes like, there becomes a point where that becomes very dangerous to have that many people with a kind of contrary attitude toward what is beneficial for social life. And there's an assumption there that the individual self-determination will ultimately manifest in social determination.
I also, and I don't know if this is too unrelated, but there's also a question of a power imbalance between mutually associated organizations, especially when we're talking about associations built around industries. Why wouldn't a key industries association, wouldn't it be more powerful? I mean, I don't want to just be like, oh, corruption or whatever, but like, what's to stop cartels? What's to stop that kind of syndication? I mean, that's a context where we see syndicates in right now,
Suppose that's true. Yeah, I don't know. I'm doing a bad job of presenting the discomfort that I have there, but there's a question there that I don't think that we've come to an answer that I'm comfortable with necessarily from a Marxist lens either, so I don't mean to present it as a one-sided problem.
Sure.
But inevitably, there's going to be dissent, and the question is, what is the most democratic way to make use of that?
You just democratically exclude them. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't feel like Rocker presents an answer to that question either in a way that's satisfying to me. And in fact, I think he is more blasé about his response to it. He's just like, well, the individual will come to full fruition. And it's like, that doesn't solve the problem.
Consensus, baby.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Sorry, that was a little weird.
No, you're good.
Did you have anything about the culture in the state, maybe, before we jump into the cavalcade? This is the same chapter here where he's talking about the culture in the state. And he says, let no one be deceived about this, our antagonists. The culture state is merely a modern idea. The one lives on the other. The one prospers at the expense of the other. And he says that all great periods of culture come at political decline.
I had some weird feelings about that because he has a lot. When he's talking about like the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? He's saying that like this dictatorship will stifle all
creative
thought, culture, all ingenuity, whatever. I didn't really have any strong feelings about it besides that I just don't know if I agree.
Yeah, it just felt like a bad characterization. Even saying that like all culture comes from times of political decline or periods of political weakness. What he's talking about is not weakness, but turmoil. Yeah. It's just like a weird framing that makes it sound negative as opposed to...
You know what? It's kind of giving weak men create hard times create strong men create good times. I don't see. That's kind of how I feel about it. It's like, okay, dude, whatever.
Yeah. I just don't have this fundamentally negative attitude toward the state. So I'm not seeing the state as some stifling culture killer. I can see how those things can coexist. I don't see that he makes an argument that convinced me that they can't.
No, I mean, I can understand an argument that like a state would be unwilling to explore new things, like in terms of culture, like kind of the oppositional nature between like socialist realism art and postmodernism outside of its Cold War context, right? But like the fact that so much of that, which we in the U.S. would think of as like cultural outpouring, creative expression, was suppressed in the Soviet Union because of their socialist realism that they had for art. I mean, that's kind of there, but it's not that that's a requirement of socialism. I mean, in Yugoslavia, you had all sorts of crazy architecture because they didn't do socialist realism or whatever. Like, so I don't think that it's necessary that the dictatorship of the proletariat stifles creativity or ingenuity or whatever. I mean, it just seems bad faith to me.
Yeah, I guess I agree. The only thing that I could think of that I don't agree with is that the idea that centralizing, say, industry would create a demand for particular stuff that then makes it impossible to explore something other than what the state is dictating is necessary, like in the context of the USSR, once Stalin started ramping up the war machine because he saw fascism coming toward them. That increase in production toward, weapons, it's not a zero-sum thing. It has to come with the decrease of production elsewhere or a reframing of a reprioritization of our time.
Rocker does make a bit of mention of the system. I don't want to mispronounce it. It's like the Stakhanovite or something. But like the actual workers' culture in the Soviet Union. I mean, in the 30s, they had a big workers' movement where there was it was wild. And I haven't read enough about it. That's the unfortunate thing. I got a brief glance at it in the last book I've read about the Soviet economy, but I just don't know enough to talk about it. But I mean, they really tried to do some insane cultural stuff around work as an institution in the Soviet Union.
Maybe that'll come up in our next reading.
I hope so. I mean, I've mentioned before, like how they tried to get rid of the 7-day week, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And it was about an analysis about their productive forces, I mean, not only did they want to get rid of Sunday as a religious holiday, but they also wanted to implement the shift system.
The calendar is capitalist.
Well, there is a segment of it that's saying, like, why do we have 3 days a week where the machines ain't running? Mm-hmm. What's the point? We separate that time ourselves. We define that time.
Yeah, it is a social construct for sure.
Yeah. They tried some crazy shit in the Soviet Union. That's all I can really say.
Yeah. Fair enough. I didn't mean to derail us there at the very end.
Not at all.
But I was looking at that quote and it came to me. Let's jump into the cavalcade of quotes.
It's a cavalcade of quotes. I do appreciate on 21... Modern socialism developed when profound observers of social life came to see more and more clearly that political constitutions and changes in the form of government could never get to the bottom of that great problem that we call the social question. Another question, of course. Its supporters recognize that a social equalizing of human beings, despite the loveliest of theoretical assumptions, is not possible so long as people are separated into classes on the basis of their owning and not owning property. Classes whose mere existence excludes in advance any thought of a genuine community. I just like the thought of a genuine community. I mean, I think, what does it mean to construct a genuine community? Maybe it's around our everyday institutions and industries, like Bakunin was saying, what's the natural form of organization, right? What does a genuine community look like?
It's fair. Just to throw out another quote that I think all good communists should agree with from the first chapter. Rocker writes, "Common to all anarchists is the desire to free society of all political and social coercive institutions which stand in the way of the development of a free humanity. In this sense, mutualism, collectivism, and communism are not to be regarded as closed systems permitting no further development, but merely as economic assumptions as to the means of safeguarding a free community." I think every good communist would agree.
Yeah.
He does have this kind of thread that he throws around in the first chapter about freedom developing best in a space of free cooperation. There are a couple of quotes that I'll throw out there. He says, "The consciousness of personal responsibility and that other precious good that has came down to man by inheritance from remote antiquity, that capacity for sympathy with others, in which all social ethics, all ideas of social justice have their origin, develop best in freedom. The freer you are, the more empathic you will become." And he closes that chapter by kind of calling back to that idea, saying, "It is from this understanding that modern anarchism was born and now draws its moral force. Only freedom can inspire men to great things and bring about intellectual and social transformations. Freedom is the very essence of life, the impelling force in all intellectual and social development, the creator of every new outlook for a future of mankind." Androcentric language aside, I agree with all of that.
In the first chapter also, he calls back to Saint-Simon, which I appreciated there, but I don't necessarily think it supports his argument to the extent that he thinks it does, because he says, when this condition of social injustice vanishes to give place to the higher order of things, which shall recognize no special rights and shall have as its basic assumption the community of social interest, government over men must yield the field to it, the administration of economic and social affairs. Or to speak with Saint-Simon, the time will come when the art of governing men will disappear. A new art will take place, the art of administering things. And all I can say is, Rudolf Rocker, I agree.
Yeah.
I will say, okay, and someone, if you're a big Spanish history head, correct me if I'm wrong here, but on the opposite page there, he's talking about, how material conditions in specific locations can affect development in a way that negates Marx's argument about the development of society historically in stages, so to speak. And I think that he's wrong, because he says that even though Spain was a hugely powerful society, they failed to industrialize before anyone else. And the reason why, I'm almost certain, is because they had 1 million colonies. They exported gold and silver from the colonies and blew their economy to shambles. Somebody tell me if that's incorrect, but I just think that he's missed the mark on that point. So if you're a Spain head, let me know. There is something I will say about the start of the labor movement. This is in the chapter, The Proletariat and the Modern Labor Movement. A critique I had of trade unionism is that it keeps you in the legal framework, and I think that that's pretty quickly disproven in kind of the historical example here. This is on page 45, whatever. Since the trade union organizations, which were at first purely local in character and confined to particular industries, had been deprived of legal right to exist, there sprang up all over the country so-called mutual benefit associations or similar innocuous bodies, having as their sole purpose the diverting of attention from actual fighting organizations of the proletariat. So, in whatever legal context, you can still unionize, so to speak. I think that maybe that was naive of me to say. I'll just put that out there.
In this chapter, Rocker accidentally defines commodity fetishism. He says it is this which reveals most plainly the horror of a system for which man is nothing and dead possessions are everything. And then right after that, I wouldn't be a former English teacher if I didn't point out the metonymy. He uses synecdoche quite well here. He says, for the factory owner, he existed merely as a hand, not anymore as a human being. I appreciate his use of figurative language there.
Thank you. Even if I disagree, I think that Proudhon's definition of socialism without freedom as being the worst form of slavery is interesting. But again, it has to do with the loose definition of freedom, right? Like what the ideal of freedom actually means. But I think there is something interesting there. Because I think that going back to the idea of a right being something that can't be impugned upon without violence, without the arisal of popular violence and resistance. Again, thinking of the modern day is that people are just a lot less willing to fight than they think they are, What else you got?
I have too. I've been thinking a lot about trade unionism, as regular listeners of the show will know, and I think that was part of what got me so stoked to read this book. And I got a quote that I think sums up your position from the last episode and a quote that I think sums up my position from the last episode. So I'd like to read them back to back, I guess.
Okay.
This is in the Forerunners of Syndicalism chapter. Rocker says, thus from the very beginning, the GNC was involved in a long series of important wage wars and was subjected besides to constant and bitter prosecutions, so that it hardly found time to begin in earnest its great work of educating the masses. So they became so entrenched in seeking economic gains that they never sought anything else. I thought that was a pretty good encapsulation of a point you had made. So shout out to you. And then in the next chapter, he says, every new social struggle makes organs for itself in the body of the old organism. Even revolutions can only develop and mature the germs which already exist and have made their way into the consciousness of men. They cannot themselves create these germs or generate new worlds out of nothing. It therefore concerns us to plant these germs while there is yet time and bring them to the strongest possible development so as to make the task of the coming social revolution easier and to ensure its permanence. This felt like a representation of the argument that I was trying to make around unions being the nucleus of organization, in that it's familiar, it's something that we know and have organized around, and so it will be much easier to make them stronger. It's funny that he seems to hold both positions.
Can I locate that quote real quick? Where are you at?
Yeah. It is the Objectives of Anarcho-Syndicalism chapter.
This is Rocker's own fault for using so many anatomy metaphors here, but just to double back on that thing we were talking about earlier, old organs with a different purpose. He's saying it right here. Every new social structure makes organs for itself in the body of the old organism. Like, isn't he contradicting himself in that statement? Good Again, point. Shame on you for using a billion organ metaphors here, Rudolf Rocker, but there's something there. Yeah.
Yeah, at the very least, it shows that the analogy is bad.
Yeah. Maybe a different one, please. Yeah. Okay, I thought there was something interesting where he was talking about the birth of the new modern proletariat. There is something to be said about the guild system. I mean, he mentions the Robert Owens and like this kind of guild socialist ideal, but there's something where he talks about the fact that in the relationship between a master and apprentice, there is a human tie. There's literally a human connection, like a direct, like a day-to-day connection even, and I think that there's something about that that's reflected in the day-to-day struggle having a different kind of, what does he say? He says that the day-to-day struggle creates a different kind of solidarity than the arbitrary rules of the party, okay? I can't find the quote exactly. That's like an 80% paraphrase. And I think that there's a parallel that's reflected in the historical modes of production that we saw under like guilds and things. We're talking about how that production has a different relationship between the employer and employee, so to speak, because the master and the student had a direct day-to-day relationship in production. And we're saying that in Rocker's argument about top-down versus bottom-up, he's saying that the top-down decree of the party carries with it a very different kind of directive than maybe a bottom-up, day-to-day, solidaristic decree of the people working. And I just think that there's an interesting parallel between those two things. It's something we didn't really mention, but I think that that is a positive point that Rocker makes, is that day-to-day struggle, just in the same way we're talking about how it prepares the proletariat for the running of the institutions of society, that day-to-day struggle carries with it a different kind of solidarity than just maybe an ideal, or something espoused by the party. He says that centralism is always a barren routine. This is on page 90 for me. He says the centralism, that artificial organization from above downward, which turns over the affairs of everybody in a lump to the small minority, is always attended by barren official routine. And what that made me think about is the creation of a collective ideal worth working towards. If we're talking about the construction of that idea from the bottom up, we're talking about something that comes from people working together on the day-to-day to solve the day-to-day needs that they have.
Yeah, the needs of the people.
Right. That is natural, organic, that's something that's based on material conditions. And I think that if we're looking at the opposite side of that, the creation of that same kind of society from top down, it's easy to see how you can fall into different pitfalls trying to centralize that energy, right? A great example is in like the nationalist ideal. We're all working towards a national product, one nation within a certain, within certain borders with certain national ideals or whatever. He says it's always attended by a barren official routine. And what it made me think of, honestly, is the cult of personality. How much of the creation of the cult of personality, whether intentional or not, is a side effect, maybe a reflection of the attempt to create a unitary working solidaristic identity, a collective singular product. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost a parallel to nationalism in a sense, like the nationalism of Stalin rather than the nationalism of, say, Russia. I don't know. I know this is a wild point, but what I'm trying to say is that I think that there is something to be said about what ideals are created when they're created from bottom up versus top down. That's really the point I'm trying to make here. And I think the cult of personality comes into play because you see it pop up in so many of these places where you see these decrees coming from top down, because it's such an easy focal point for that energy. It's easy to say, we'll follow Stalin. Stalin has the right ideas, because it removes some of that day-to-day struggle autonomy in that process. And I think that the cult of personality fills that void in a way that is not a good way, and I think that Rocker is acknowledging that, where he's saying a culture built from the bottom up is a fundamentally different culture.
I happen to know that comes up pretty early on in our next reading.
Oh, so lovely. I'm so happy to hear.
So more on that next time, probably.
Awesome.
I will say, just to finish that quote, because the next line really gets to me, like you said, that it is always attended by barren official routine, and this crushes individual conviction, kills all personal initiative by lifeless discipline and bureaucratic ossification, and permits no independent action. I just think that's an untrue characterization. That's one of the things that bugs me about reading a lot of the anarchist stuff that we've read thus far, is that I'm not saying that, say, the USSR, for example, is beyond reproach, but that's just not a fair characterization of what it actually looks like. And so it calls into question all of the characterization that comes with it, because I fundamentally disagree with that one.
Well, likewise, I think that in two veins, right? In one, just like how I was talking about earlier, how Rocker is talking about the Soviet Union from the perspective of the terror. And I know that the terror wasn't really terror in the same sense that Western propaganda likes to make it happen. So I think that it's that same kind of thing. I also think that in a more ideal sense, say you're born into the Soviet Union and you live 20, 30 years or whatever, your individual actions are still individual actions, even if they're formed around the society. I mean, even if they're formed within the society around you. If you as an individual grow up in the society and think that you need to, work solidaristically for the benefit of the party, the glorious party of the people or whatever, like that is still your individual action. That is still your individual will. Even if it's not this ultimately perfectly free idea, it's still the conclusion that you came to given your surroundings, given your circumstances. You know what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah, a philosophical ideal of freedom doesn't exist for anyone. You are always acting inside of the context in which you exist. It doesn't matter, you as an individual, your actions are still free of your own will and an expression of your own creative intention, whether they be under Stalin's USSR or you were raised in a free associative Soviet. It doesn't matter, No matter what, you're always your individual action is always shaped by and will ultimately butt up against the limits of the society that you exist in.
Yeah, I mean, because what he's referring to here is only the individual convictions that are crushed, not any of the individual convictions that support the system. None of the individual convictions that made up the society, which overwhelmingly were popularly in favor of the society built around them. And I'm not saying that, just because it was popular means it was right or whatever, but what I am saying is that, I don't know, it seems biased, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I got to find this quote that I was looking for before. I don't need to find it. I'm just going to be shitting on him and his characterization of the Bolsheviks, so it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Let me just phrase it as a question then,
yes.
Okay? Because this really did stick in my craw, and I will give you a quote that is not so positive that Rocker says about the USSR. But he's espousing this idea of social justice very early on, this idea that people should be afforded as much justice socially as possible. And in the same breath as shitting on the Bolsheviks, it is not possible to look objectively at what the Bolsheviks did for the people in Russia and argue that they were not afforded more social justice than they were under the Tsar. It's just inherently bad faith.
Well, you know what he does? He literally does an apples to oranges comparison, just like we were talking about in Socialist Reconstruction, comparing the U.S. to Cuba. He says, it really stuck with me because I read it a bunch of times trying to figure out exactly what he was trying to say. But he says, he does this, and I'm just now realizing that it is that kind of apples and oranges comparison. He says that an American working man who under moderately decent working conditions earns enough to feed, clothe, and house himself humanly and has enough left over to provide himself with some cultured enjoyments feels the possessions of millions by the Mellons and Morgans less than the man who earns hardly enough to satisfy his most urgent necessities feels privileges of a little caste of bureaucrats, even if these are not millionaires. People who can scarcely get enough dry bread to satisfy their hunger, who live in squalid rooms which they are often obliged to share with strangers, and who, on top of this, are compelled to work under an intensified speed-up system, that's that Stakhanovite system I was talking about, which raises their productive capacity to the utmost, can but feel the privileges of an upper class which lacks nothing much more keenly than their class comrades in capitalist countries. And the reason that it stuck out to me so much is because it's totally wrong. It's totally wrong. We're not comparing the proletariat of Russia to the people in America. We're comparing them to what they were beforehand under the Tsar. You're absolutely correct. And I think that that's a ridiculous comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. Another absolutely ridiculous thing, before I say a few more positive things, another absolutely ridiculous thing that Rocker says is in the Objectives of Anarcho-Syndicalism chapter. After quoting Kropotkin, he says, Russia is today farther from socialism than any other country. Are you fucking kidding me?
Again, 1938. Okay, we're talking about Hitler and Mussolini are actively in there.
Exactly. Just, come on, man. I came into this to be your friend, and you're doing this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I had the same thing.
Just, my eyes could not have rolled more.
Yeah.
Just,
right.
My goodness.
I mean, 1938. 1938?
I know.
What the fuck?
This is exactly the text that I sent you. The unmitigated gall in 1938 to say that Russia is the least socialist country.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. Crazy stuff.
Okay, the last few I'm all in agreement with.
Okay.
On page 70 of the AK Press version, the workers must learn that not only must their social liberation be their own work, but that the liberation was possible only if they themselves attended to the constructive preliminaries instead of leaving the task to the politicians who were in no way fitted for it. I agree. Where's the lie? Also, even though I've shat on some of his analysis early on, he did definitely get this right at the end of chapter 4. Again, this is 1938, the last World War and its economic and social consequences, which are today constantly working more and more disastrously, and which have grown into a definite danger to the very existence of all human culture, are sinister signs of the times which no man of insight can misinterpret. He was certainly correct there.
Yeah.
And then I'll close with one more, I guess, just to, again, prove that there are plenty of things that I agree with. He says, in the methods of anarcho-syndicalism, even the freest ballot...
I was literally about to read this
Really?
quote. I literally was. Yeah, go ahead.
Even the freest ballot cannot do away with the glaring contrast between the possessing and the non-possessing classes in society. It can only serve to impart to a system of social injustice the aspect of legal right, and to induce the slave to set the stamp of legality on his own servitude.
Yeah.
You're right. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and to throw on, parliamentary participation has not brought the workers one iota nearer to their final goal. I think that's a little hyperbolic, but I do agree also.
Yeah. And, just to give him some credit, I will say that in his critique of the Soviet Union, he mentions that the prisons are filled with socialists of every school and anarchists too. Yeah, that's correct. That is an objective fact. Yeah. And also the objectives of the Bolsheviks internationally in the formation of the Comintern, the third international, please forgive me there. Yeah, it was a little unfair to anarchist movements in the rest of the world. I agree. Great job, Rudolf. I think that is it. So this was Anarcho-Syndicalism. I thought there was a subtitle.
Theory and Practice.
Theory and Practice, which mine does not have. Well, I think, I've said my questions already here, but I'll say them again. In what ways do anarchists recreate the state? In which ways do Leninists recreate anarchism? I think that there's a dialectical question there, so sorry if that makes you sound pretentious, but it is truly a question I have. Anarchists, if you have strong feelings, you know where to email. You've done it before. What questions did you have, Aaron?
Nothing that I haven't stated already, but I guess another dialectical question is really, what is the correct line on revisionism? Where is the appropriate line for holding to our expectations of the way things should be run and allowing for dissent? There's chasm of gray area in there that I'm not so sure has been defined to my satisfaction by Marxists or anarchists.
A broader question I have that, unfortunately fascism is a huge gaping hole right in the middle of is what happened to anarcho-syndicalism. I mean, I know that the answer is they succumbed to fascism.
That's the answer.
No,
yeah.
but afterwards, obviously, if we're thinking of anarcho-syndicalism as the other half of the First International Movement, right? We know what happened with the Marxist side of things. What happened with the anarchist side of things? Obviously, they were still around in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And still are, I'm sure. Even if they don't call themselves anarcho-syndicalists.
That is an interesting question. Why was the defeat in Spain so resounding that it had seemingly killed the movement? There were plenty of socialist defeats throughout history as well that didn't kill socialism as a movement. Yeah. What happened there?
I was thinking about it when he's talking about the history of unions, and he says that originally there was a ban on combination. And what happened is that the middle classes realized that no amount of repression would stop these unions from forming, and so they allowed them to form. And so what I think the answer is that they've been co-opted. I think that the unions are no longer the primary driver of this. They've been so co-opted to the point where that same kind of efficacy of a trade union struggle, a truly anarcho-syndicalist struggle, isn't as possible. And that was my next question is, if we were to try to bring trade unionism back to a point where an anarcho-syndicalist movement could happen, what would that even require? I mean, is that even a possibility? I mean, is that even a twinkle in my eye? That's a real question, and I think that has to do more with the conversation we've been having about trade unionism overall in the modern day. But if we were to say, yeah, I think I'm a subscriber, Rudolf Rocker, how would I even go about putting this into place?
Yeah, I would second that question and add the clarifying question of what does a trade union even look like, or what replaces it? What is its modern day manifestation? Because so much of industry has been industrialized and exported, at least in the United States. How do you even unionize workers in this regard? It's, your Uber question from before or whatever.
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
Yeah, and even on top of that, I mean, Rocker makes one or two mentions of the global south in this. He says, like these countries where people have lived off of super profits, eventually the bill will come due. But there isn't really an address of an international situation in this. I mean, it's really just like we don't respect nations or borders, and that's kind of the end of the line for Rocker in this essay. But there is a question of, in that same sense, like if we're going to build the union struggle, that includes the global south by necessity, because so much of our industry is based off of materials and things that come from those countries, unequally, exploitatively.
Yeah, 100%.
So that's not a critique of Rocker or anything like that, but it's just something that goes totally unanswered in this.
Yeah, it's a context that he wasn't writing from.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this was pre most of the global South liberation struggles. So,
You should read this if...
I think you should read this if you need a little bit more anarchist history. I think that's a good one.
That is a good one.
I think you should read this if you're interested in anarcho-syndicalism as a, I don't want to say a unitary idea, but as a single body of thought. I think that this is a really good intro to that. If you want more of a structured look at what anarchist organization could be, this, with a focus on the trade unions, I think does provide some of that. So, what are we reading next, Aaron? In the hardest possible shift from anarcho-syndicalism theory and practice, what are we reading next?
Next up, we are going to start Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend by Domenico Lacerdo. We've only done this one other time in history where we split a book into two parts in the history of the show. No, but
in 2 years, baby. You know? Yeah.
We're going to split this into 2 episodes. So we're going to read the first 4 chapters for the next episode and then leave the remaining chapters for the next. That'll give us plenty of time to read the longer text. And also, we know that if we tried to read it all in one and then record it as one episode, it's going to be a 5-hour fucking episode.
Yeah, and, the book has a nice separation, it looks like, between the history of Stalin and his...
post-mortem history.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I actually didn't say this earlier, but that'll be so great because it'll give me time to read more shit. Yeah. All the stuff I've been reading has been mainly about the history. Maybe it'll be nice to read some post-mortem stuff too. Yeah. I know for a fact that Conversations with Stalin by the Yugoslav foreign minister, he says some crazy shit.
Really?
Yeah, it's like end-of-life Stalin, and he's like, maybe we could do socialism with a monarchy. I don't even know. So, yeah.
So anyway, grab your copy of Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend so you can read along with us. Don't get left unread.
Don't get left unread.